I was told that we're going to have English as the working language. Я говорю по-русски, and in English, und auf Deutsch. По-украински мне безумно неудобно, я говорю. Мне очень стыдно за это. Но вы мне простите. Я родился в Киеве, но when I was 9 months, I left for England in 1978. So I never had a chance to, like most people from Kiev, to grow up bilingual. My bilingualism was Russian and English, not Russian and Ukrainian. So I apologize for that. So I've been asked to talk about information war, and I think I'll use the opportunity to try to work out what is information war. My background is in sort of television and writing, and I don't actually know very much about war, or else I didn't until really the last year when everyone started talking about information war. And I went on a journey to try to understand what military people mean by information war, because when journalists talk about it, we think of a debate. Here's one side shouting, here's another side shouting, and they shout at each other. And that's what I used to think information war was. Information war is not that. Information war is a military discipline, and actually it's very unclear what role journalism has. If it does, it's actually a very small role, but we'll get to that. So I'm going to take you out of Russia and Ukraine, and I'm going to take you across the world to the Philippines. And I'm just going to read an extract of, it's from a 500-page Pentagon analysis of China's 3 warfares. That's what the Chinese call it, the 3 warfares. So I'm just going to read, this is from this Pentagon document. In Asia, China has elaborated the 3 warfares, a mix of psychological, media, and legal war. Legal war, they mean using false claims and bogus maps to make claims on other territories. As detailed in a study by Cambridge's Professor Stephen Halper, China uses the 3 warfares to strengthen its power in the South China Sea and undermine US presence in Asia. In 2010, for example, when the Philippines refused to retreat from the disputed Scarborough Shoal, China used a mix of economic sanctions, psychological intimidation in the form of a flotilla of military ships, and media message calling the Philippines' behavior radical to establish control over the area. China spins the openness of the Western media against it, referring to how US ships that enter waters only China recognizes as its own are actually undermining international law. The Western media's repetition of China's statements allowed China to underscore its claims that its domestic laws had primacy in international waters. In 21st century warfare, concludes the Pentagon study, warfare is guided by the belief that those whose story wins is more important than those whose army wins. So I think listening to this outline of Chinese strategy in Asia, we can hear very distinct echoes of Russia's strategy in Ukraine and Europe. So I think if you look across the world at the moment, you're seeing the development of several theories of information war. The Russian theory is referred to in Russian military thinking as information psychological war, the essence of which is to subjugate and break another country without ever touching it. I'm not going to look at Ukraine because you're going to tell me about Ukraine, but the essence of Russia's information psychological war, I mean, the theory starts around 1999 when the defense minister Igor Sergeyev basically admits that Russia can never compete with the West in terms of military hardware, so it has to find asymmetric and revolutionary paths to assert its imperial ambitions. So what does this mean? Well, how can you bring another country to its knees without ever touching it? How can you secure a victory, and here I'm quoting Russian military doctrine, purely in the area of human consciousness, which is the essence of information psychological war. You break another country by breaking its will, by breaking what Russian military theorists call its psychosphere. So let's take the case of Estonia. As I'm sure you know, in 2007, there was a series of disturbing events in Estonia. In 2004, Estonia joined NATO, and really, you know, the Estonians thought that they had managed to sort of escape Russian imperial influence forever. They were part of the world's most powerful military alliance. They gained EU membership. Their Soviet past seemed to be behind them. And then in 2007, when a Soviet-era statue is removed from Tallinn, you have a series of media attacks on Estonia. So Russian media accusing the Estonians of being fascists, of many sort of sins. You have a cyber attack on Estonia, which sort of incapacitates Estonia's internet, banking, media systems. And then you have riots at the end of the day breaking out in Tallinn, the largest riots that Estonia has seen pretty much in the 20th century. Now, what is the point of all of this? Everybody can understand the Russians would be behind a lot of these non-military attacks on Estonia, but what can they really achieve if they're not going to invade? You know? If they're not going to annex Estonia, which they can't, because that would mean a war with NATO, which Russia would lose. What can they really achieve? And I went to Estonia recently and I asked the president, what is your great fear? And he explained, well, he and I and some of his assistants, we talked about something called reflexive control. Reflexive control is one of the cornerstones of Russian information psychological war. The idea of reflexive control is to know your enemy's communications logic and information systems so well that you can manipulate them from inside. So this sounds very abstract, but practically speaking, the idea that they felt was every time Russia made Estonia look vulnerable, it undercut Estonia's reputation in the world. All the journalists like myself would start going, oh my God, Estonia's under threat, the Estonian stock market and investment climate would plummet. So it was a way of messing up Estonia without ever touching it, to make sure that it could never really flourish as an independent state. So here we're getting into information psychological war. It's really not about sort of like a media debate or persuasion or any of these sort of propaganda things that we learn about at university. This is a military doctrine using economic, media, and other tools, cyber aggression, in order to bring another country to its knees. There is a media element, but it's nothing to do with persuasion or propaganda as Jacques Ellul described it, as you're probably taught to hear. When media is used, it's used to confuse, divide and conquer, sow conspiracies, and so on and so forth. It has nothing to do with journalism. So the idea that journalism could be the people that respond to this is, I think, maybe a little bit of an illusion. And in a way, this is not new. There's always been disinformation and psychological aggression as a form of warfare. So the Iliad, the Trojan horse, is the greatest disinformation operation in the history of warfare. However, there are specifics to information psychological war, or what China calls the three warfares. Firstly, it says that war is perpetual. Usually information operations, a deception operation, is part of a military maneuver, like the Trojan horse. So the Greeks want to take Troy, they use a bit of deception to get inside. Here, the information war is endless. It never stops. We're out of the Clausewitzian paradigm of war being a way to achieve political aims. This is war without end, never stopping. Russian military theorists refer to it as an invisible radiation that blurs the distinctions between peace and war. So this is perpetual war. This is a new thing. Also, because of the new information technology, because of the internet, TV, etc., there's an opportunity for a new intensity of information psychological operations. The age of information is turning out to be the age of disinformation. And thirdly, and this is the one that I find most fascinating and also kind of ungraspable, victory in this war is purely in the mind. There is no invasion. There will be no flag planted. There will be no moment when you go, haha, we have won. Crimea is actually the exception. Crimea is a very old school type of warfare. Information psychological war, and again, I think everyone here understands this very well. The point of supporting the war in Donbass is not the Donbass, it's to break Kiev. It's a psychological operation, not actually a classic military operation. This is very, very strange. I don't think anyone has really grasped what the consequences of this are, or how we measure success and failure. I mean, the idea that, let's say, Russia wants to do vis-a-vis NATO is to humiliate the US by showing that NATO is unworkable. So NATO is, as I'm sure you know, the idea of NATO is the idea of collective deterrence, that a military attack on one country is an attack on all the other countries. And basically, Russia could never do a military attack on a NATO country, but all it has to show is that NATO is unworkable by undermining the narrative and the idea of NATO. So if NATO is based on the idea that a military attack on one country is an attack on all countries, what if it's not a military attack? What if it's a cyber attack on Estonia? What if it's a small insurrection in Latvia? What if it's a media attack in Bulgaria? And the point is never to invade these countries, but just to show purely in the realm of PR, purely in the realm of perception, that NATO is a joke, that therefore the US is impotent, that therefore why don't we all just ally with Russia and create new neo-authoritarian alliances. This is very, very unusual. This is pure literature. I mean, Jacques Derrida once said that all the world is text, and that's essentially what the Russians and the Chinese are sort of using now as military practice. So what do we do? And I'm only just starting to get my head around what one does, but I think there are three areas that we have to look at. Instead of talking, the first one, instead of talking about an information war, I think we can talk about a war on information. And this is where journalists do have some role. In the Russian and Chinese use of media, the idea isn't so much to win the argument, but to destroy the media space with sort of conspiracies, with rumors, with gossip, with intimidation. And so it's a war on information. The idea is to trash the information space and make sort of a rational discussion impossible. So there is, information has to be defended. I think we'll see the creation in the 21st century of a new profession, sort of post-journalism. I mean, Yevhen Fedchenko has instinctively started this with Stop Fake. For the information space to be defended, we're going to have to see institutionalized stop fakes across the world. Much like Amnesty, there are Amnesty Internationals to protect human rights in the 20th century. I think we'll need Amnesty Internationals which will monitor disinformation. So I think that's maybe the small role that media has. Apart from that, most of the other sort of solutions I'm not sure are in the spirit of journalism. The best way to defeat a lot of the information operations is political. We need better policies. I mean, in the Baltics, the reason that the Russian info-psychological war works is because the Baltics have to be very careful because they get so offended by this, but they have to progress in their social cohesion policies to create a European, Estonian, Russian identity for their 30% Russian minority. This has very little to do with media. This is about social policy. And the third solution is our own information operations, which doesn't have to involve disinformation. I'll leave you with a book to read. The former head of information operations for the British Army, there's a guy called Steve Tatham. He's written a book called Behavioral Warfare, I think. I can send a link later. But basically, he makes the case that we do our psychological operations all wrong. We don't understand our audience. So he makes the case that we need a new methodology of analyzing audiences. It's called targeted audience analysis, which would understand their real local needs, and we can then base psychological operations on that. So, for example, he uses the case of ISIS in the Middle East. So the US's first response to ISIS was a slightly ridiculous advertising campaign trying to show people in the region, in Iraq and Syria, what was Iraq and Syria, I don't know what we call it now, that the US is a good guy. So it was like adverts of wheat fields and Statue of Liberty, and it's like, why would you want to attack the US? Look how beautiful it is. It backfired. The amount of, sort of terrorist attacks went up after this advert. So what Tatham says is that they did a proper sort of analysis of attitudes in the area where ISIS was trying to expand, And they found that actually there was a small percentage of people who hated the US, and you could never change that, and they would keep on blowing themselves up and keep on doing terrorist attacks. But for most people, even though they officially agreed with ISIS, their actual ambitions were to send their children to study in the US. So there was a gap between what people said and how they actually behaved. We see a very similar thing in the Baltics. So there's a large percentage of the Russian minority in the Baltics say how much they love Putin, but they all want to send their kids to study in Germany. So we need to develop policies and propaganda in the good form, not disinformation, but communications campaigns which understand the audience in a much more subtle and much more complex way. So maybe you can tell me about Ukraine. I'm not sure. Is Yedina Ukraina really the message that you need to spread in Kharkiv? Is it actually, do we need a much, much subtler and cleverer understanding of what people in Kharkiv really want and think? But you can tell me, because I don't know as much about Ukraine as you do. Did that make sense? You're all sort of staring at me like, but that's probably because there's translations. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay, cool. So, questions? Yeah.
You said about the war started when the psychological impact exists in Donbass. About it, what can you say about counter-impact or counter-propaganda in Donbass, in psychological stuff, and did you think about this counter-propaganda?
You mean Ukrainian counter-propaganda?
In Ukraine, in Donbass, yeah.
No, you're going to tell me. I don't know. I haven't studied it.
You didn't think about it?
I haven't studied. I'm launching a project now which will look at Ukraine as a sort of laboratory of information war. So I'll tell you in a year's time. I don't know. I haven't looked at it. But I know that people here have. But I just don't. I think you guys know much more than I do about the specifics of Ukraine. Ukraine is quite unusual in the sense that we're seeing a lot of classical war used in Ukraine. The war in Donbass is a war of the 19th century. Information psychological war is not actually what we're seeing in Ukraine, mainly. I mean, information psychological war is what China is doing in Asia and what Russia wants to do to the West, and what it will do to Ukraine. Once the fighting dies down a little bit, that's its plan. But yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sorry. I think you know more than I do.
You have mentioned Amnesty International as an organization that can monitor something about human rights. For example, how do you think, what kind of institution or organization, NGO or whatever can be that can control also use some tools in monitoring propaganda, or how it can fix the problem?
Yeah, so this is the problem. So we've gone through this in America, because after the last elections in America, where a lot of disinformation was used, a lot of stop fakes appeared in America. Some to monitor the Republicans and Fox News, and they began branded as representatives of a left-wing reality, and some right-wing ones, which monitor New York Times. And the problem was it all fractured. Instead of creating a reality-based discourse, I'll go slower, sorry. I'm always told by translators I need to go slower. Instead of creating a reality-based discourse, it fractured again and again. And this is really the problem we're having. Part of the aim of information psychological war is to destroy the potential for a reality-based conversation, and in that doubt, you can use sort of psychological aggression and subversion. So, what happened? What's the lesson we know from the human rights movement? So in the 70s, as I'm sure you know, there was a moment, Finland and Geneva, where basically the great powers agreed on a concept of human rights. And on that, you could then base Amnesty International. You have to have that moment of agreement first. So my sense is that it shouldn't be a government-driven, but we need all the large news organizations, including Russia today, if it wants to be a news organization, to have a sort of a Finland moment or a Geneva moment where they sit down and say, these are the rules of the game. Not what we will do, but we don't do lies, etc., etc., etc. National, there is some national legislation on it. So in Britain there are some laws about how a news organisation has to behave. has due balance, impartiality, accuracy. You don't have it in the US, of course. And internationally, there's nothing. So they would have to sit down together and really create a convention on media behavior. Once we have that, then we can have an Amnesty International of disinformation. They will be able to give ratings, like Transparency International give ratings. So they could give ratings to media organizations. So, you know, Russia Today would get whatever, and BBC would get whatever. I think that's the only way. I think that's going to be the only way forward. I don't see any other way, because the problem is, the minute you create a disinformation agency like Stop Fake, it risks then just being, you know, seen as part of a divide. So listen, I think we are part. The funny thing is, information psychological war is happening globally as journalism is going through a crisis. So we have two crises happening. I think what we're all more concerned about as people in media is the crisis in journalism, but it's meeting a military crisis at the same time. So it's becoming a very important issue, I think. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Inna, and I'm wondering what people in England and in Europe think of Ukraine. Is it all about a failed state, or what is the image of Ukraine in? Well, I'm interested in England especially, but if you know what people in Europe think,
I mean, I haven't seen. I'm sure there's some sociology. I haven't seen it, So in place of sociology, I can just give you some anecdotes.
What do you and people all around you in England think is happening right here?
No, they think Russia's invaded Ukraine.
Or maybe they do not know about what is happening at all?
No, they think Russia invaded Ukraine. Of course they do. They think Russia invaded Ukraine, but they don't care. And they don't care because there is no idea of what Ukraine is. And, I mean, it's football, hooligans, prostitutes. Pretty much.
So is it a failed state?
Yeah, it can be a failed state. Failed state is a very difficult concept. I mean, that's certainly the message the Russians give. Yeah, look, for them, Russia's a failed state as well. Just a bunch of Slavs killing each other, who cares? No, seriously, that's what it is. Like, why is this our problem?
Thank you.
Do you think that's because of Russian propaganda in the UK? That's the way the UK sees Ukraine?
Partly. It's also the fault of several British novelists who portrayed Ukraine this way. I'm not going to name names. No, yes, definitely, the Russians do all they can to help, but they're working on very easy ground. And I think it goes deeper. I think Western culture, Western European culture needs... look, to put it very brutally, you can't be nasty about black people, you can't be nasty about Jews, you can't be nasty about Muslims, you've got to be nasty about someone. And so there's a generic Eastern European who is the butt of jokes. The Poles are sort of real and we see them, so we know they're actually great. Ukrainians, who are they? You know, they're probably all fascists and hooligans, prostitutes. It's almost, Ukrainians, because it hasn't produced its own narrative, has let itself be the kind of, the sort of, you know, the subject of a certain cultural racism, basically. Look, the classic one was before the European Football Championships. There was a series of films on the BBC about how Ukraine is full of hooligans and fascists, and no coloured people should travel to the European Championships. There are less racist attacks in Ukraine than Britain, because there are no black people here. I mean, what racist attacks? And it's incredible, but, you know, so that's the picture. It's the new Untermenschen, they're fascists and hordes. So when, no, they're not fascists, they're sort of hooligans and hordes, and so when the Russians go, they're fascists, they go, well, probably fascist, we don't know, might be. So there's a lot of work to do to communicate Ukraine's identity and just Ukraine's identity, I mean, not even story. So I think that's become a sort of a national security issue now. I'm sure the Ukrainian government is going to fail now because they're bad.
Hi Peter, I'm Maria Zatarenko from Media Communication Program. So you mentioned the phrase, the reader's phrase that the world is a text, and then you told that there is a need to defend that space. Can you please provide some examples from your own experience, or probably just examples or cases of such a defense, like for example Stop Fake, but it's a kind of institutional defense, probably, you know, any other type of defense. Thanks.
Well, NATO was created, it's very funny, so I found myself NATO was waking up to this, and I found myself at a NATO policy seminar in Kiev late last year. And it was bizarre. There's all these soldiers there and all these civil servants. And at the head of a room stood the head of NATO for strategic communications, who's a former journalist, a guy called Mark Laity. And he was essentially giving them something like a lecture that you get in the first year of film school or in a philology department. Basically, he was saying the world is made out of narrative landscapes, which are made up of stories. All the world is text. And all these sort of civil servants and soldiers were taking like notes. And so what NATO, they realized this is a problem. They realized that what has to be defended are narratives, which is how on earth do you do that? So they've set up something called the NATO Center of Excellence for Strategic Communication, which is going to be based in Riga, which is slowly beginning to think about this. They've actually hired, I'm not sure if I can talk about all of this, because some of it might not be public yet, but they're going to be looking at new forms of sociology to have a much better understanding of attitudes among various populations, to then understand what stories need to be told. I think what we have to get out of is, let's tell the American story, let's tell the British story. No one, that kind of storytelling is not working. It's actually very counterproductive. We have to start understanding in a much more granular way, the way TV producers always do. What do our audience care about, and how can we become, while not losing our own identity, extensions of the narratives that they already desire. So we're entering a slightly different. I'm going to use the word propaganda game. I don't have a problem with the word propaganda. Propaganda just means communication, mass communication. So it's just starting, and the 21st century is going to be the age, really, of that tension and these completely new battles. Obviously, NATO is very ill-suited to this. NATO is all about missiles and tanks. So do we create a non-kinetic NATO? Is one of the big... non-kinetic means a NATO that deals in non-physical war. So it'll be fantastic. We'll have sort of soldiers and literature professors working together. It's going to be bizarre.
My name is Arthur, from School of Journalism. And my question is there any political ideology that is more resistant to war information than others? Because it seems like more radical types, like nationalism, conservatism are more resistant to informational war. Could it be so?
Well, no, totalitarian regimes are the most resistant. So the information, both for China and for Russia, it comes from a very similar point, and for the terrorists. You can't beat the West militarily. How can we find asymmetric ways? What are the weaknesses of the West? And the weakness of the West is that it's an open system, it's a liberal democracy. So therefore, you can set up pseudo-TV channels there, pseudo-NGOs, use the church as a weapon. And when I talk to the heads of states in Estonia, they're like, liberal democracy is more important to us than Russia. We're not going to ban Russian channels. We're just not going to do it. Could be counterproductive to do it anyway, but they're just not. So the most vulnerable state to information psychological war is a Western liberal democracy. We have no idea how to deal with it. The best one is North Korea. Can't get in there.
Yeah. Could you tell, please, how do you think, how could we influence people who are influenced by the propaganda? As we know, it comes to their mind and it's difficult to change their point of view. Is it possible, for example, for Ukrainian people in Donbass?
Well, I don't know about Donbass. I just haven't been there, to my embarrassment. I was meant to go. I will go this year. The answer, the asymmetric response to information war is not anything to do with creating media, it's media literacy. So listen, we've gone through this already. At the start of the 20th century, you have an informational boom, and you have a new intensity of propaganda. And one of the figures who I assume you study here, if you don't, you should shoot your professors, is Walter Lippmann. who worked inside the American propaganda system in the lead up to the First World War. A lot of the techniques the Russians are using now, the Americans used to get America into war in 1980, including disinformation, 5 minutes of hate, all these kind of stuff. That's where a lot of the things were pioneered. Lippmann worked inside of this and came out appalled by the power of new media, sort of in the 20s, and wrote a great book called Public Opinion about how people need to develop their media literacy to withstand propaganda. And there was a lot of projects then as well in the 1930s to help people understand how they're being manipulated. Then the rise of fascism, etc. Walter Lippmann went on to found the New Republic, which was a great magazine in America. He was the first person to analyze the way the New York Times was getting everything wrong during the Russian Revolution. So he was like, he's a bit of a pompous writer, but it's someone you guys should really, really be studying. And so we had that. And so you had 100 years of media literacy, and I don't know about here, but certainly in Britain, we would have classes at school deconstructing adverts. So we would all understand how we're being bombarded. At the moment, there's this rush of new technology and a rush of psychological manipulation. The asymmetric answer is media literacy and educating people to make them understand how they're being psychologically manipulated. And I think this is now a national security issue. It's not just a fun thing. So we have been here before 100 years ago. This always happens when there's a new sort of rush of information technologies. So I think that's the main answer, media literacy. But neither will that be enough, because while we educate everyone, the West might have disappeared as a phenomenon. So we do need to do operations as well.
Hello, I have a question. Why do you think propaganda works so well in democratic countries that have access to all kinds of information? For example, Russia today has very high ratings, like in the United States, Latin America, United Kingdom. Why is that?
No, it doesn't. It has really low ratings. No one watches it. It's a joke. I don't know why.
No, in America they are like the second most watched.
After Al Jazeera, there's only 2.
No, there's BBC too.
No, BBC is way above it. BBC America is not even close. No. Russia Today, be very careful about this. Russia Today is essentially a psychological operation. The point isn't the content. The point is to have it. To show we're so big, so strong, we can buy football clubs, we have a TV channel, we have nuclear weapons. Why do you want to support these little Ukrainians? Come to us, we have money and power. The existence of Russia Today is the point of Russia Today. In England and America, it has virtually no influence on the media sphere. Spanish language places and Arabic might be different, because they just go with the anti-American flow. There's already a huge anti-Americanism there, and they just go with that, and they get shared a lot. Also, there's a great meeting between Kirchner, who's Argentina's president, and Putin, where they talk about uniting their media powers. Obviously, Assad is working together with Russian media to create they're creating this neo-authoritarian global media conglomerate. But in England and America, no. I mean, all their ratings come from YouTube, where it has nothing to do with news. It's sort of cats and meteor showers. Be very careful, Russia Today. Every time we get scared of it, we fall into their trap.
So are you saying like your ratings are kind of artificial? So their
ratings are really low. I don't know where you're getting these stats. They're really, really low. Their high ratings come from their YouTube views. That's where they're that's what they're always boast about. Well, the most watched channel on YouTube. But not very hard to fix, views on YouTube. Secondly, it's not for their news stuff. It's not for Ukraine. It's for, a man eating a cat. That this is Margaret Simonyan has to prove to Gromov, head of the presidential administration, her boss. I was going to say something else, but I'm not going to be like this. They have to prove to Putin why they should get the next 100 million. Yeah? And they say, look at all these stats. And Putin doesn't sort of go into the details. He's like, 5 million views. And the fact that the 5 million views was for aliens. They do alien stories. So I'd be very careful with Russia Today. It's not... There's a very good piece in the Washington Post yesterday analysing Russia Today's ratings, and it broke it down very well. Nobody's getting their information about Ukraine from Russia Today. I mean, they're very few people. Anything else? let's go fight the information war. Thank you.